and Europe to address these issues. Well, they thought when they went in, well, we'll signal our seriousness, we'll show them how serious we are. And we concluded, look at the Russians. They're weak. There was no shock at all. They didn't have massive air and missile attacks to destroy everything in sight. They did not overrun the place with armor. They've moved very cautiously in small penny packets. The Russians are incompetent. They don't know what they're doing. They're idiots. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say those things about the Russians and then turn around and say the Russians pose a serious threat to Europe and are armed to the teeth to invade Europe. It's the same sort of nonsense. There were no Ukrainian victories. The Ukrainians were losing from the day the Russians entered. The Ukrainians have been losing disproportionately to the Russians because of superior firepower on the Russian side. Now, today, there are roughly 700,000 Russian troops surrounding Ukraine, either in the south, in parts of it, or in the north, in Belarusia. Of that number, about 550,000 are prepared to enter Ukraine. And of that number, about 300,000 are combat troops, as I was. Those are people that actually go in and at point-blank range kill the enemy. That force is ready. It's going to go in. And when it does, it's going to annihilate what's left of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army has been bled to death. They're down about 190,000 effectives. Oh, sure, they've got 200, 300,000 other functionaries running around in uniform, but they're not trained. And they're losing people every day. The most recent count I saw was something in the neighborhood of 1,900 casualties a day, 6,000 dead in the month of January, or perhaps 6,500. They weren't sure. Ukrainians have taken horrendous casualties. The Russians have not. And that's because the Russians can fire 60,000 artillery rounds, rockets and missiles every day, and the Ukrainians can barely manage to fire 15 to 20,000 back. In fact, right now I'm being told it's dropped down to about 10,000. 75% of all the Ukrainian casualties are from strikes from artillery, air, rockets, and missiles. This thing is over, and it's going to be ugly because what's going to happen is we're going to see a cleanup, and there's no amount of equipment that we can send that's going to change anything. And the 10, 20, 30,000 foreigners in Ukrainian uniform are not going to make a difference. They, too, are going to be killed in what's coming.
We're even seeing in especially the British media, people and the German media as well, high-level current and former defense and foreign policy officials saying that they should even entertain the prospect of boots on the ground, NATO boots on the ground to help Ukraine in this conflict against Russia. Do you see a realistic possibility that this could lead to a nuclear conflict with the United States and Russia?
No. The Russians have made it very clear that unless they are attacked with a nuclear weapon, they will not use nuclear weapons. We understand the consequences for the use of a nuclear weapon. We do not enjoy superiority in the nuclear arsenal over the Russians. We're not going to do that. So there will be no nuclear exchange. As far as the officer is talking about boots on the ground, you're shocking me because the German generals that I know, retired and active, have all said absolutely not, out of the question. The Germans have ammunition for 2 days of warfare. The notion of going there and fighting is absurd. There are even Polish generals, active and retired, who privately have said the same thing. The only ones that I'm aware of who are on the lunatic fringe to talk about this are, of course, the British. And the British Army now is substantially smaller than the Marine Corps. I think it's probably 70,000 troops. They have almost no ammunition for more than a day or two. They have very little substantial armor, artillery. They're not prepared to deal with any of this. So I guess that's why the British are talking about it, because I suppose they figure they're far enough away nobody will ever expect them to show up anyway. The French absolutely said this is absurd. A French general that I served with is a good friend. He said, Douglas, the only thing the French army is prepared to do is go on safari in North Africa. All of these armies have been structured for this low-intensity conflict nonsense. So you don't have armies that are ready to fight on the scale that we're seeing in Ukraine. And remember that we trained the Ukrainians, we organized them, we equipped them, we gave them the best we had. And what's happened to them? They've been smashed. So much for Russian weakness.
Colonel, a lot of folks will say that, and look, I think obviously we know each other long enough that you know that I am sort of coming from the same place that you are on this, albeit without your expertise and without your experience. But a lot of, just to play devil's advocate, a lot of folks are saying that the rush that this invasion of Ukraine led to Finland and Sweden seeking to join NATO and leading to even greater NATO expansion is evidence of the fact that the NATO alliance works, that Russia would not dare attack a NATO country. And it makes sense because countries are trying to be a part of NATO so that they're not the next target that's eaten by Russia. Is that sound reasoning?
Well, Russia never had any interest in attacking NATO anyway. I mean, that was very clear to me when I was in Moscow in 2001. And it was clear to me all through the 90s when I worked with the Russians. And it was clear to me in the few instances in which I interacted with them over the last 20 years. There was no interest, and frankly, they hadn't spent any money on the army. I mean, frankly, we've already given the Ukrainians more equipment and infused them with more cash than is spent on the Russian army in a year. So that was always complete and utter nonsense. As far as the Swedes and the Finns are concerned, I think the elites there are part of this globalist neocon cabal that meets routinely in the World Economic Forum to transform the world into some sort of society of internationalists that they dream of. These people are out of touch with reality. There was never any danger to Finland. And the Finns, once you dig down deeper in Finland and in Sweden, you begin to find people that are saying, wait a minute, is this really necessary? What does this mean? And most of them have figured out it means they're going to have to spend a lot of money on defense, which they haven't had to spend in the past. I think the opposite is the case. If you go back to this conference that was just held on the 20th of January at Ramstein in Germany, where they had representatives from dozens of nations, all the NATO states, and Austin, the Secretary of Defense, said point blank to them, look, the time's running out. Our window of opportunity is closing. We've got to help these people. We've got to get this stuff to them, or it's going to be too late. And you know what kind of response they got? It was terrible. People said, oh, yes, we'll send this, we'll send that. What are we finding out right now? The tanks aren't showing up. Mm-hmm. The equipment's not showing up. People in the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia said, wait a minute. You know, the Ukrainians are probably going to be annihilated. What does that leave us? What kind of artillery and tanks and aircraft do we have? Everybody's backing off because this thing is going nowhere. And ultimately, I think we're going to see NATO go out of business. I think Germany is going to walk out of the camp. It's going to take another 6-12 months before they sort themselves out. But the Germans are not interested in going to war with Russia. They correctly judged there was no threat from Russia, which is why they were taking the natural gas that they were getting from the Russians and using it to great success because it was cheap, it was available, it was quick. And it was fueling the German scientific industrial base, which is the real engine of prosperity in Europe. I think if anybody thinks that NATO is in good shape, they're delusional. But then again, I don't blame them because they're not getting the truth through the media. I mean, the lies that pour out of the mouths of the people in the mainstream media in the West are astonishing. It's beyond belief. When you ask them, well, what do you know about Ukraine? What do you know about what was going on in that country? What's been happening there for the last decade? Nobody knows. Right. Nobody knows that we installed a government there. Nobody knows that we've manipulated that place and turned it into a platform for attack against Russia. And by the way, you know, they talk about how horrible Russia is. If you look at the quote-unquote Zelensky regime, it compares favorably with Stalin. The Russians are far more democratic in treating their own people and others infinitely better than Zelensky and his henchmen.
Colonel,
But there's no knowledge of that here.
That's for sure. I'm already out of time, but I have to ask you two final questions very quickly. One is, it was reported this week that the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett indicated that both Putin and Zelensky were willing at the beginning of this conflict to try and come up with a negotiated settlement. But according to the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, he said that NATO decided that it was necessary to continue to smash Putin and not negotiate. Why would NATO take that tact if the two countries in conflict with one another were willing to come up with a negotiated settlement?
First of all, Naftali Bennett is telling the truth, except for one point. NATO is irrelevant. Washington makes the decisions. Washington treats the countries of Western Europe and Eastern Europe essentially as vassal states. They don't pay any attention to what those people say or what those people want. Never have. Everything is decided in Washington. And we shouldn't be terribly surprised. Mr. Macron is somebody that was selected and groomed and installed in office thanks, for the most part, to George Soros. George Soros is frequently mentioned as the shadow national security advisor in the White House these days. And Mr. Zelensky also owes a great deal to George Soros, along with other oligarchs, for his position. So I think there's something else happening here. We're talking about a class of bureaucrats and politicians who share the same sort of attitudes, but it's really Washington, D.C., and whoever is behind President Biden. And again, I urge people to go back and look at the oligarchs that stand behind his White House and his party. Those are the people driving this train. Those are the people that are forcing this war. The average American doesn't know anything about it, and frankly, why should he or her? They don't care about this sort of thing. So why is this happening? And it's tragic. It really is, because here are two groups of people, Ukrainians and Russians, and whatever their differences are, they didn't have to go to war. And Ukraine is destroyed. The nation is finished. And that burden rests firmly on our shoulders. We drove this into existence. It's horrible. It's an atrocity.
That's for sure. A lot of lives lost, a lot of people forced to flee their homes, and you wonder what it was all for. Final question, sir. Whenever I say something different from what the conventional foreign policy wisdom in the country is right now on the Russian front, and say we should not give a blank check to Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight back against Putin, immediately the comparisons begin of Vladimir Putin to Adolf Hitler, and of people like me, people like you, to Neville Chamberlain. Now, you don't sound like Chamberlain to me, but why is that analogy? Because I'm trying to preempt the callers as they call in about a minute. Why is that analogy flawed? Putin as Hitler, Doug Macgregor as Chamberlain.
Well, this is the popular narrative that was spun out in every intervention, and you have to look at the people, their intellectual backgrounds, their origins. Who are these individuals that turn Saddam Hussein into Otto Hitler, who turn anybody that they don't particularly care for into Hitler? Who are these people that are trying to tell everybody it's 1936 again, and we have to become active in the world to prevent all these terrible things from happening? Ask yourself that question. Who are these individuals?